Hello everyone, today we talk about the Lipka Tatars as this proud European people of Islamic faith, an ethnic group of Turkic-Mongol origin fundamentally, which over the centuries was integrated within the peoples settled essentially in Central Eastern Europe, and their warrior disposition and their loyalty making them valuable in the many wars that tormented the region, especially at the service of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Right? We talked about both the Tatars and the Cossacks actually in the Polish-Lithuanian forces. Made multiple videos about that. There is a playlist about the Commonwealth Army entering a bit in the details even of the service conditions, there's also some wars, but how these troops were organized. Today we tell the story of the Lipka Tatars per se, very simply, just to spread awareness about them, as their history explains the troubled events of those lands, right? Almost up to the present day, where the populations we'll see still exists. But just to make you understand how much of a recent military history this is, we can start from the end that we will recuperate, in fact, after in the final of the video. On September the 10th, 1939, talking about the Nazi invasion of Poland, because on September the 10th, 1939, there is this dramatic episode that remains in military history. You know that Polish warfare always maintained, and also thanks to these steps influences, is an excellent equestrian culture. Right, we have seen it also in the video about the Polish-Bolshevik war that we will refer to, also relatively to the Lipka Tatars later. But this episode concerns the 1st Squadron of the 13th Wilno Uhlans Cavalry Regiment, which launched a mounted charge, saber drone, against Nazi infantry in an attempt to consolidate a bridgehead behind the Vistula. See, at this point the Polish troops were everywhere in retreat, tenaciously trying to re-establish a defense, and the fighting followed a chaotic rhythm after all, because the Nazi columns, which had entered Poland just 10 days earlier, as you know, advanced rapidly. Not only those of tanks or motorized ones, but also those of foot infantry, preventing essentially any organized resistance, and giving thus rise to fierce sudden battles whenever they succeeded in cutting off the retreating Poles. And it would be interesting to make a video about Polish strategy in 1939, because if the Nazis had been drawn in kind of more a traditional warfare, right, against more entrenched Polish positions, the war may have gone differently. It is not to be given for granted that the Poles in 1939 or the French in 1940 were doomed, right, and the Germans had to win. This is for anybody who has studied the operations, but just, whoever knows what war is about and why it is fought in the first place knows that that's not the case. But this is also, in fact, knowing military history for real in the details, and that's why it's better also to discuss this elsewhere. But it's important to stress, because aside from the still kind of stereotypical memes that were created for very specific and, of course, serviceable and purposeful reasons after World War II in Europe, for countering effectively the communist threat, etc. We have been told, like, again, lot of stories that are actually not real, right? In terms even just of the assessment of military quality. But in the case of the Poles, the point being that normally those are represented as the more gallant, unsung heroes of the story. But the point is that they screwed up badly again because they chose a bad strategy. Because they weren't doomed at all, right? They weren't impaling themselves against the Nazis because they didn't have any other choice, right? And the same goes for the French. They had a hell of an army, and also the Germans, of course, like any successful victor, must need, without any option, luck, because without that, no war can be won in the first place. But again, we have been told another story, because for people it's somehow simpler to think like that, and of course that leads to nothing but underdevelopment. Again, yeah, I will start a series about World War II because certain things objectively, like after they have been massively consolidated by historiography from decades, and you understand there is a parallel world living, especially on YouTube, I must say, that still doesn't wake up, doesn't want to wake up, doesn't want to know, to read, to have any form of strategic culture or military historical education. But that doesn't matter. But this action we're talking about here, that of course is somehow irrelevant in the broader strategic scale of things, the charge of the 1st Squadron of the 13th Cavalry Regiment, the Wilno Uhlans, was successful because the Nazis were overwhelmed with heavy losses, and the Polish troops, thanks to the regiment, escaped the danger of being surrounded in that case. There is all a history of Polish charges, basically almost all of them successful during the Nazi invasion of Poland, that, as we will see in the end, also have been falsely romanticized by claiming that they were carried against tanks, which is notoriously false, right? Tanks arrived after the action was over, and it was mostly infantry that got the work done. But this charge specifically was also the last carried out by the squadron, because 2 weeks later, in another clash, the soldiers of the Wehrmacht took their revenge, and the entire regiment, as a matter of fact, with what remained of the 1st Squadron, was destroyed in the Battle of Suchowola, right, as eventually would be the Polish army on the longer run. And most of its survivors were taken prisoner, the others dispersed. Some managed to escape to Hungary, some essentially hid themselves to continue the fight in clandestinity, in the resistance. So why is this episode important? Because it's, in fact, the truly last also of a secular military tradition, right, of which these feats of arms were only the latest in a very long trail, in fact, distinguished by loyalty and courage. And that of the Polish-Lithuanian Tatars, in fact, the so-called Lipka Tatars, from the name given by the Tatars themselves to Lithuania, represent perhaps one of the most overlooked, or at least unknown, military histories of properly European culture. That, yes, includes these protagonists, especially of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth legacy. In fact, the aforementioned 1st Squadron of the 13th Polish Cavalry Regiment was, in 1939, still entirely composed of horsemen of Tatar origin. Proud, also on that occasion, to raise the banner with the star and the crescent of their Islamic faith while fighting for defending a Catholic nation that had provided them with an opportunity to westernized, to be integrated, to be part, in fact, of a state of the importance of Poland. Today, the Central Eastern European community of Tatar origin numbers a few thousand individuals, mainly divided between Poland, Lithuania, and Belarus. But their history has, of course, ancient roots that we will try to look at now. It's just one of the innumerable colorful pieces of European identity. I would like to stress this, right? That as all of them, of course, influenced it and exerted on the affairs of the continent in a hardly negligible way. The history of the Tartars in Europe starts from the Middle Ages, right? Even just saying the word Tartar, one conjures up the idea of some, I don't know, distant Siberian steppes, rugged landscape of grassland and shrubland. But actually, what we call the Tartars, or Tatars, as it would be more correct, even if traced back to one of the many nomadic tribes that made up Genghis Khan's armies, are to be considered a European people, especially the ones actually inhabiting geographical Europe, because they are essentially just a sort of collective name with which one uses to indicate a set of different ethnic groups, born from the mixture of peoples that, yes, just like the Cossacks, originating from the term Kazakh, right? And this Turkic-Mongol origin, right, coming from, in fact, across the Urals or closer places, telling you the truth, rather than a broader Turkic-Mongol origin. We have seen this many times, even talking about Turkic history, the Mamluk one, and also the systems through which the same peoples used to draw manpower from the subjected populations, and sometimes just banally looking at them, and not just in, of course, in today's Poland or Belarus, but even, faraway places. You can realize that they are pretty much, some of them at least, are pretty much white. They're obviously descending from Indo-European populations or Uyghur Finns, and others, conversely, instead, evidently more Mongolic, being there quite of a blend. But this is exactly the point, right? In those videos about the Polish-Lithuanian army, we've seen this specifically for the Cossacks, right? Especially the ones of Ukraine that largely were essentially the same Slavic populations that had turned semi-nomadic in lands such as the wild plains of the southeast. In fact, the areas occupied by the steppes, pretty much the ones where, in fact, the wars being fought today, as they were called, by the way, by the Poles, right, were organized. So we're talking about ethnic groups that first settled on the side of the Urals in their ancestral origin around the 7th century AD. We're talking about essentially Turks at that point, some Mongols, but that's the century. We've seen it many times in the Western Eurasian steppes, in which essentially the Turks start taking over the Indo-Europeans, but still fundamentally ruling on a majority of them, right? This happened also in the Volga region, where, as we've seen in a video about its military organization, that these peoples altogether founded a multi-ethnic state that historians have called Volga Bulgaria was founded, and which saw the coexistence of these, in fact, Turkic Bulgars ruling over other populations, but also integrating them, co-opting them among their elite, among which there were, in fact, Uyghur Finns, the same Indo-Europeans. I mean, even Eastern Slavs that had come that far during their migration. And by the time of the partition of the empire, that had significantly reduced the importance of Volga Bulgaria, right? But had also given an important center from Sarai, right? So along the same river. The Khanate of the Golden Horde would rise, right? This also would give rise to another, say, a lesser center, the Khanate of Crimea, as it would actually survive longer than the original Golden Horde during the modern age, stretching also in the northern hinterland of the Black Sea, where many populations essentially merged, right? And with, again, still as you can see today, in Eastern Europe, with still an important Indo-European prevalence, right? Yet from a cultural point of view, exactly because they dominated the steppes that had been somehow populated also by sedentary populations by a degree, or others that, as we've seen, even passed from sedentarism to semi-nomadism, again, especially after the Mongol conquests, retaining their political and cultural identity, right? Also religion and costumes, and especially this fierce pride about their military lifestyle. The history of the settlement of the Tatars in the territories essentially of Lithuania, right, begins in the second half of the 14th century, when individual Tatar clans began to emigrate, mostly from Crimea and the coasts of the Black Sea in general, but also from a broader area, of course. And so the lands dominated by the heirs of the Mongol Khans of the Golden Horde, and towards the shores of the Baltic Sea. There were essentially two dynamics. One, say, more long-term, but of lesser intensity, that is to say, the gradual process of sedentarization of these peoples that also were seeking opportunities like in the surrounding sanitary powers. And we've seen that since the High Middle Ages, or even before, of course, the European polities had normally began to sedentarize an important amount of these nomads that were called, for example, in the Rus, the Swoi Pagani, and they used to say literally our own pagans, because especially when the Mongols arrived, these Turks that had coexisted again since the migration era at the frontier, especially with the in Eastern Europe and the Balkans, were considered more familiar, right, than the troops of Genghis Khan's generals. And it was a way, we've seen it especially for Hungary, with the Kumans, in that case especially, as refugees exactly after the Mongol conquest. They would have invested the same country. Same goes for Poland. It was invaded thrice by the Mongols, for not talking about the Rus entirely. And this was a way essentially of military colonization, essentially increasing manpower in the sparsely populated Central and Eastern European lands, that in these foreigners could find an important support for the local monarchy, given that these tribes were mostly either Islamic or pagan, or actually both at the same time. And yes, that is feasible. That exactly being essentially infidels, and so being treated differently from the Christians, depended more on the sovereign policy, and thus would be more loyal to the crown historically than to the local oligarchies that were trying to compact power, and also in a more ethnic sense. The more important reason why at the end of the 14th century these Tatars begin to move in quite consistent numbers, as we will see now, north west, is that the Golden Horde had challenged the hegemony of the great Tamerlane, heir of Genghis Khan, and probably also descended from all these elements. Like, he was mostly a Turk, actually, but surely he had Indo-European ancestry as much as Mongol one at the same time. And that was mostly a political choice, even just being a Mongol, right? That's something that even the Ottomans revered for what the Oceanic rulers of Central Asia had been at the point, even when they kind of vassalized the same Crimean Khanate later on. Well, the immense Timurid Empire had been knocking at the Golden Horde's gate, essentially crushing them, as the Golden Horde was defeated by Tamerlane in battle. This brought to a political collapse, with the consequent exodus of the noble Tatar families who had led the revolt, because naturally the common Tatar would have just also become part of this quite clientelally stratified, decentralized mechanism through which this actually short-lived Central Asian, Middle Eastern empires, such as Timur the Lane's one, were at the end of the day right to remain there and paying tribute in cattle, if they lived in some other ways, such as the most sedentary centers of Sarai and surroundings, maybe paying in other, like even in precious metal and in trade commodities and so on. But of course the elite had been responsible to the disobedience towards the Timurids was hunted by them and decided to move. The natural destination from the northern hinterland of the Black Sea was, of course, the Grand Duchy of Lithuania at that point. Of course, before then Poland, because it's further east, and historically had profited of the weakening of the Rus to actually extend, as you know, an overlordship over those areas. I made a video about medieval Lithuania and exactly in this time frame, and also coming out civilized essentially by the Rus Palatinate of Kiev and so on. And the Grand Duke of Lithuania, Vytautas, or Witold, if you prefer the westernization, had already welcomed, as we've seen, it was somehow normal, the Tatar predecessors with open arms in his country, giving them lands to settle, privileges, actually even the free profession of the Islamic faith, and even the noble condition to their elite within the same Lithuania, right? And all this in exchange for the Tatar valuable military services. You know what was happening to Lithuania. Essentially, this power that had remained unusually pagan in Europe had been resisting. That was actually the main reason why, to the Teutonic Crusades that on the longer run had, it doesn't matter how harsh Lithuanian resistance was, basically had the upper hand. And that's the reason why the same Lithuanians had, while stemming the Germans from the Baltic, still extended this enormous territorial dominion up to, in fact, almost the Black Sea, and drawing from this wider area the necessary resources to stem the Teutonic Knights, resources which, again, were not even satisfactory, because of course the Germans were also broadly colonizing from a Western background with much greater international connection, trade activity, support, in fact also the papal blessing, that however brought in fact the Lithuanians at this point to consider more concretely the Christianization that had been just mostly a banner against the Crusades than any specific aversion to Christianity per se. And so any resource that could be brought in, including the Tatars, was vital. There couldn't be an attrition with them. They could be instead co-opted, like this is the case. And we will see how even today's Belarus, right, the Tatar population is significant in spite of genocide during World War II, etc. And in those same years, Lithuania was also approaching Poland, the most Catholic Poland, at least considering the surroundings, to join arms against the Teutonic Order, right? And Poland was the greater power between the two, in spite it was smaller extensionally, because it was richer, more populated. The Lithuanians had actually been raiding Poland up to a certain point, even in the late Middle Ages. Now, however, that bond that, as we will see, will ultimately bring to the Lublin Union in the 16th century started, right? As Lithuania had at some point even the possibility of siding with the Muscovy. There were dynastic marriages arranged, but eventually chose Poland, and the Jagiellonian dynasty even converted to Roman Catholicism, significantly enough, despite, of course, Eastern Europe remaining Orthodox historically, even with the so-called Uniate Church. I made some videos about these topics in the Ukrainian history playlist, so if you're interested, it's not specifically Lithuania. We could make videos also about this country, but it was also for and the sake of some more contemporary informative needs, right? Poland and Lithuania started thus becoming a powerful confederation, right, to counter the many common threats, the Teutonic Knights, of course, but also the Scandinavians, the Russians, the Ottoman Turks. They were already rising, and as we have seen in this case, also helping the Tatars against the Timurid Turk Mongols. Now, the Tatars' reputation as warriors was well deserved, and for the Polish-Lithuanian Confederation, it was a contribution of fresh forces that they badly needed to resist the Teutonic onslaught, and it was also the beginning of a precious and lasting soldiering, which in fact affected the military culture of the nations. After just 10 years after the arrival of the Tatars and their settlement in the lands of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, the Tatars, the Lipka Tatars now, as they began to call the country themselves as their new home, accompanied Vytautas and his army under the nominal leadership, however, of the King of Poland, Ladislaus II Jagiellon, on the battlefield of Tannenberg, or Grunwald, if you prefer, where on July the 15th, 1410, they faced the Teutonic Knights by defeating them so decisively as to sink them in a crisis from which they would never recover. This was the moment of greatest glory, at least as far as the Lithuanian military history is concerned, but also the Polish one, surpassed in this case only by the siege of Vienna, and of course other important achievements, even over the Muscovy and other surrounding threats. But Grunwald, as you know, is this moment in which the Polish-Lithuanian power steps up, right, and basically consolidates a position that would last in Central and Eastern Europe as unchallenged fundamentally for 300 years. And in this battle, the elusive tactics of the Tatars, especially their skill at feigning flight and provoking their opponents into pursuit, as well as their exceptional skill as archers, of course, served to wear down the heavy cavalry of the Teutonic Order, which was so easy prey for the counterattack of the Polish knights. So the best combined arms that, in spite of the further westernization that Poland would underwent in the last centuries of the Middle Ages, was already introducing those, in fact, Eastern steppes elements that would especially revitalize unavoidably with the Lublin Union and the extension of the Polish frontiers into the boundless steppes, a particular equestrian tradition that would constitute an anachronism of success, even up to very late in time. We have seen it the other week talking about the 1683 siege of Vienna and, of course, the feats of the Polish hussars. And there you see, in fact, with these names, you know, the hussars were traditionally Hungarian cavalry. Then you have these Tatars, then the Cossacks, etc. The Uhlans, right? All these are names that come from this broader steppe tradition that were not even properly either Turkic or any other specific ethnicity, but the entire properly military identity of the Eurasian steppes, from which these horsemen had dominated unchallenged for millennia, right? And that now were being absorbed by the West. It was gradually, in fact, taming them. But that could fuel, right, when adequately channeled, as probably in the best way ever achieved, exactly in the Polish-Lithuanian Confederacy, extraordinary resources, extraordinary warlikeness especially, and the finest horsemanship. It could be even imitated by, in fact, the Polish Szlachta that surely didn't lack equestrian capacities, but that developed them further compared to Western feudalism, and even managed them to be tactically successful during the Renaissance, when cavalry had shrank on the Western battlefields, right? And this aspect, I think we have described well in those Polish warfare videos, but is to be stressed because that charge on September the 10th, 1939 is just the ending of a fil rouge that dates back exactly to that time, right? And I think it's fantastic. Retrospectively, consider another fact relative to warfare as an instrument of politics. That is, these lighter horsemen were capable of supporting more successfully heavy cavalry employment, right? If medieval armies had definitely produced this formidable heavy cavalry capable of crushing frontally any opponent that would stand the ground against them, they were also, as the Mongol invasions had proven, somehow vulnerable on the flanks. They needed a lot of supplies, right, for the war horses that consume an enormous amount of fodder and water. And the lighter troops, as we have looked in detail also, looking at the Ottoman armies, for example, that could call in this best kind of, yes, Turkic, but somehow also Mongolian, of the many legacy that the Ottomans collected, including the Roman one, etc., they could simply screen larger armies, the most, in fact, logistically vulnerable ones. The big ones could besiege Vienna, just to make an example, and thus projecting them strategically much further. And this was a way, thus, for the Polish king to facilitate the employment of the nobility that would feel more shielded by these swarms of lighter cavalry, and somehow framing them better, also, again, for the political objectives of war in the royal expeditions, right, and goals of unification, consolidation of the system. As you know, the Polish Szlachta developed in parallel also similar means, as they had essentially private armies that in their oligarchic latifundia that they could simply raise, in also hiring Tatars on their own for that matter. So that's another issue, was not a problem solver, but definitely an important glue politically and culturally, stemming from the achievements of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, is to be owed to these humble as loyal, however, servants of this major Catholic power. In fact, the religious freedom guaranteed by Vytautas back in the day to his subjects, to Muslims as well as to Jews, by the way, and pagans even, as Lithuania was just freshly converted and still somehow barely Christianized, consolidated his personal power as a ruler and was the basis of his political and military successes, consigning him to history, in fact, as Vytautas the Great, right? And in Lipka folklore, Vytautas is in fact a hero, remembered in numerous tales. There is also Jan Sobieski, as a matter of fact, but Vytautas kind of has the lion's share, because he founded those privileges. In fact, the Lipkas even pray, remembering Vytautas as, quote, the defender of Muslims in non-Muslim lands. And naturally see it from, this is a very eloquent statement regarding to the horizons of the Tatars to a European dimension, because obviously non-Muslim lands were just, existing far beyond Lithuania, and also relatively close to the same Tatar ancestral lands. At least I'm talking about the one of Crimea and the other coasts of the Black Sea. But that's how, in a sense, few they had traveled, right, to consider Lithuania just the only non-Muslim land that existed, and thus how close to in range to within to it, first of all, but within the same continent it was culturally, right? And this is how, in fact, Europeanly rooted these peoples really were. As we've seen, they didn't like much Timur-Lane, right? Nor they would like the Ottomans. In fact, yes, these Tatars were Muslims, but were not feeling as brothers with co-religionaries of other powers, especially the ones threatening now their beloved Lithuania and Poland. So at the beginning of the 16th century, the Ottoman sultans insistently tried to win back the Lipkas to their cause, relying on the common Islamic faith. After all, the Ottomans were resuming the universal dream of not just the Dar al-Islam, but literally, in fact, of world domination through the jihad. And it's obvious that in an age of faith, right? And also confessional clashes, even among the same Christians, but the Muslims were even more factionally and sectorally divided, as you know, than post-Protestant, or also as far as the Catholic and the Orthodox were concerned. Thought, well, these are essentially Islamic people that are living in actually enormous numbers in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. It's been estimated that by the Treaty of Lublin, they were as many as 200,000, right? And that there were up to 400 mosques in the Confederacy. Today, I think there are only 4 mosques in Belarus that date to in fact the time of the Lipkas, as you know, before the nationalization and kind of the gradual disappearance of their, if anything, of their common political awareness, right? We have an Ottoman embassy telling the Sultan that there were at least 100 mosques in Poland at the time, because, by the way, the Tatars were settled in Poland too, right? But in the same way, Lithuania was easier to choose because it was kind of bigger, less populated, and it had the lower hand in the Confederacy, so the Polish kings could arrange things a bit more comfortably for that matter. But as we've seen, there was probably an advantage as far as also the Lithuanian establishment was concerned. And when the Ottomans tried to win the Lipkas to their cause, relying on the common Islamic faith, the Lipkas' response was contemptuous. Because they literally said, quote, "Neither Allah nor the Prophet commands you to steal, nor do they command us to be ungrateful. In defeating you, we limit ourselves to killing ordinary bandits and not our brothers." This is quite eloquent, right? In the name of their faith, they were actually rejecting the sultanial overlordship. They were sticking to their Polish benefactors, and in defeating the Turks, they were just killing ordinary bandits, as of course they saw what the Ottomans did when invading also the Confederacy, laying waste, etc. Of course, not differently from what they themselves did, but of course they saw it like from as a good cause, in a mostly defensive way. And they even refused properly to be kings of some co-religionaries, just per se, right? Consider that they were all, as you know, Sunni mostly, as by Turco-Mongol tradition, but there was no bond anywhere for just loyalty and fidelity to the Commonwealth's cause. In 1569, with the treaty signed in Lublin, the alliance between Lithuania and Poland resulted in the establishment of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth proper, right? Which stretched, as you know, over this enormous territory, which included, in addition to Poland and Lithuania, of course, also present-day Belarus, a large part of Ukraine and Latvia, and even edges of Prussia, Russia, and Moldova. It was, as you know, one of the single most successful powers of the early modern age. At this point, it was properly living its golden age to core. And again, it's just a universe on its own, and it's part of those big realities that, of course, today disappeared from the map, right? Just, of course, Poland and Lithuania still exist, but with very different boundaries and with especially very different, you know, historical premises, right? As far as, of course, all the process of Ancien regime mechanism was set in motion since the 19th century with nationalism, socialism, and so on. And this is valid for every country practically. And the Confederacy became, as it already was, right, according to the Central European norm, a sort of elective monarchy, which assigned great political weight to the aristocracy, including the Lipka nobles. And this is important because the Lipka nobility was essentially Polonized in the process, right? There were also lots of Christians actually joining the Lipka Tatars as such. So it was actually also a multi-religious community. In some cases, even a multi-confessional one within the same. In reality, we're still even pagans among these groups, but mostly they had assimilated from the Tatar background to the local country. Right? For example, the Lipkas essentially spoke and wrote Ruthenian, eventually Belarusian, but they still maintained the Arabic alphabet. Interestingly enough, right? So it was a melange of cultural legacies. As far as the Confederacy was concerned, of course, the territorial size of it was gigantic, right? And the institutional system that we described essentially was the cause of troubles, of continual internal crisis that would be, in historical perspective, paralyzed by the slow and contentious decision-making process. One of the worst crises of the Confederacy concerned precisely the Lipkas, because as we have seen, Ottoman diplomacy failed to win them over to their cause, but the excess of religious zeal of the Poles succeeded instead. And this was the only case of also relative unfaithfulness of the Lipkas to the Polish-Lithuanian cause, right? And it was caused, in fact, mostly by an important repression that also the religious freedom of the Tatars had undergone. In fact, the Counter-Reformation in Poland brought to a squeeze on religious minorities. It's something that we have seen also in that video about the Treaty of Lublin prevented the Confederacy becoming properly a Polish, Lithuanian, Ukrainian Commonwealth, which could easily become at that point, telling you the truth. But both sides lost the chance to do it. Thus, in all this counter-reformistic zeal that brought to the Uniate Church, also the Orthodox subjects, with the papacy and so on, there was the inexorable erosion of the privileges at the basis of the pact with the Lipkas as well, as they were Muslims, and proudly so, by the way. So aside from this cultural blend that, as we've seen, brought even Christian elements within them, still, of course, they identified primarily in their Islamic faith and in their loyalty to an institution that had allowed them to prosper. And the freedom of worship, once guaranteed to non-Catholics, was thus severely limited. And the factors that brought to the Tatar revolt are also more technical, more military, because the Polish sovereigns, with the intention of modernizing their armies, which was definitely a complicated enterprise with that institutional system, also began to enlist Western mercenaries. As we've seen, they were mostly Germans. The Poles were seeking for pike and shot professional units, right? That, especially during the 30 Years' War, were kind of also often available on the market. And for the Lipkas, this meant a reduction of a quarter of the emoluments, right, intended to pay the expensive mercenaries, and obstacles to obtaining command roles, because they preferred, the Polish establishment preferred to entrust those to the professional Western servicemen that were well versed in the tactical innovations of the military renaissance that Poland fundamentally had been missing, again, for political and strategic reasons concerning, the maintenance of this enormous eastern frontier was mostly steppes. And so that while facilitating the development of an important, and the maintenance, also important heavy cavalry as opposed to the West, also, however, lacked an important amount of heavy infantry, as instead the West was mostly maintaining. So especially in the wars on the western and northern frontier, those elements were quite precious. Naturally, there were also, as you know, many nationalities in the Confederacy, including the Germans. Right, we see in the city of Danzig, for example, provided with an important amount of pike and shot militias, and so on. But what the Polish army needed, of course, just as Spain, France, etc., that was properly a national army, something starting to be also de facto semi-permanent at least, and or with an important core that did in fact develop around the royal army, which subcontracted military operations to the nobility that contributed, of course, with its own private armies. At the same time, there were lots of foreign troops brought by mainly from France, that, as you know, had very, very strong ties with Poland historically, but also even copying, for example, a Janissary unit in the Royal Guard. So this kind of also ethnic curiosities that, however, were very important to stress the universal nature of this power, because it was as big as an empire in practice. Another problem related to the employment of foreign mercenaries mostly, and also the broader troubles that as we've seen, the political institutional balance brought to the Confederacy, was that the new mercenary troops did not hesitate to plunder the territories they crossed, whether friendly or enemy. And the Lipkas who lived in the border areas also had to suffer thus the oppressions and abuses that the Polish sovereigns tolerated, betraying an ancient friendship pact with the same Tatars. This is important because, imagine the Tatars were settled somewhere where, for example, an oligarch had managed to expand unchecked because the monarchy couldn't reach as far. Well, the oligarch was more important institutionally than the Tatar community there. So it was a brutal world to live in. I mean, even just the Polish ethnic peasantry were treated as, probably only in Russia, in Eastern Europe broadly meant, even in Lithuania, the boyars didn't go lightly on them. But, one of the single most brutal ways that you can imagine. I mean, the Polish peasantry, until very late in time, till the 18th century, was something unspeakable in the way it was treated by the nobility. There was properly almost an ethnic discrimination, because first of all, the nobility, of course, thought to be properly another race of gods. But as you know, the Polish Szlachta was developing this sort of Sarmatism, which was all a posture that you can see in the magnificency of their, in fact, of their arms and armor as properly as hussars, as the top Polish military, as legitimately the true dominators of the land in almost a steppe guise fashion. Remember that the Mongols here did leave an important trace, right? We see them mostly in Muscovy. There was essentially a Mongol creation, at least in the Tsarist way we've come to know. But this was true by an important degree also in Lithuania. And Poland did resent of it, because it was essentially the unchecked power of the oligarchs that would also make the Confederacy collapse. So the Tatars were quite important for making the system old, and that's why they rebelled, feeling betrayed and defenseless in 1672. Because they saw that even the sovereign now couldn't do much to help them, so they picked up arms. And this awareness is important. There are many political, social intersections in this revolt that, in fact, broke out properly in Poland, and for 4 years after getting closer to the Ottoman Turks, the Tatars fought alongside them against their own homeland, the Confederacy, with the advantage of knowing the country inch by inch, right? And when you are a Tatar horseman, you literally know it inch by inch, because you have properly a psychophysical experience that is literally spent on crossing this enormous territories back and forth on a regular basis, knowing the weather, knowing the terrain, knowing properly all the passages, the forests, the rivers, and with an incredible capacity of projection in a territory that was also partly reliant on you for his self-defense, and that therefore is going to suffer even more from it. However, and I stress this was the only, admittedly a big one, of course, but the only case of infidelity, right, of the Lipkas towards the Confederacy. The new alliance between Muslims did not work either, right? Centuries of coexistence with the Europeans had, in fact, profoundly affected the lifestyle of the Lipkas. The customs of their Tatar origin were much less rigid, in fact, than those of the Turks. For example, the Lipka women did not wear the veil and enjoyed the same rights as men, being also educated together with their male peers, and resented the oppressive Ottoman hierarchy and the absolute obedience due to the Sultan. Right? There is properly a sense of unmitigated liberty running in the veins of these warriors. Thus, it was that the Lipkas offered the then supreme Polish commander, the ataman Jan Sobieski, an agreement with which they proposed their conditions for the return to the Confederacy. Sobieski refused at the time, but when he managed to turn the tide of war in his favor by driving the Ottomans back and recapturing the strongholds of the same Lipkas, he was extremely benevolent towards them. That's a hell of a lesson from a hell of a monarch, right? Welcoming the Tatars back into the Confederacy, right? So, of course, it was a temporary crisis. These, as we have seen, are the same years that would lead even to the Ottoman siege of Vienna. The other option was Warsaw. So, of course, the Lipkas knew that if the Ottomans had invaded Poland, things would have gotten complicated because, again, they were just light horsemen mostly, right? They worked functionally together with the Polish heavies to be part of a big power. But when this crisis was over, also the Lipkas understood, of course, that their future, as their past had been for centuries, and it would remain, in fact, was Poland, right? And thus, having become King of Poland in 1674, Jan Sobieski strove to restore to the Lipkas that he needed to, as we've seen, keep the country together, all the privileges that had been stolen from them in the previous decades, mostly from the Szlachta, right? Here also the royal army, as we've seen, had stormed the Lipkas strongholds, but due to the Ottoman possession, say, and of the Lipkas in that moment, and stipulating now instead a new loyalty pact with the Tatars, which was never violated again. And this is when, at the Battle of Vienna, Tartars actually met against Tartars, right? Not only the Lipkas participated in the last phases of the aforementioned war against the Ottomans, but September 11, 1683, they were among the protagonists of the Battle of Vienna, overwhelming, together with the Polish winged hussars, who were the, as we've seen, core of excellence of the army, the troops of the Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa Pasha, who besieged the Habsburg capital in the greatest cavalry charge in the annals of military history. And as we've said and seen in many circumstances, you don't have a heavy arm operating without a lighter arm, right? So the grandiose Polish cavalry charge at the gates of Vienna, of course, was rendered possible by the cooperation not just of the Germans with the Poles, which was crucial, mostly combining that kind of steel pike and shot element with this shock cavalry element, but within the latter, of course, the Polish winged hussars and the Tatar light horsemen. That were also, I would add with a bit of sadism, a bit the ones that when the charge was over and the heavies were exhausted due to the weight of their arms and armor, would pursue and slaughter like animals the fleeing enemies, right? And basically carried out what the same Tartars in the Ottoman camp had done, and those, by the way, had fled once actually the Polish German army had arrived to relieve the siege, had quarreled with the Grand Vizier, who ordered them to keep up a fight. But again, those were still light cavalry, and the Ottoman heavies were entrenched in the siege works around the city. So they literally went back to, in fact, also probably were distant cousins, right? They came mostly from Crimea, from other places, and so on themselves, and leaving this Ottoman tide being methodically and systematically slaughtered by this hellish figures, as you can imagine a Tartar, frenzied in his ancestral, shamanic trance state, like while being covered in blood from head to toe, like butchers with a saber and legs, everybody who he meets fleeing, right? And these, again, I cannot stress enough how radically rooted it is probably in the DNA of most, actually of us as well, right? This vision of the again, reminiscent of the Steppes times, of the winged angels slash devils, because the angel of death is also an etheric figure, that's Saint Michael, etc. Literally flying, dominating, lording over the battlefield from the skies, slaughtering the tectonic masses, crawling and hiding in the dirt, where they had to return once they have been massacred, as they have failed in front of the eyes of God, right? And this is what these people live by, right? It's a common universal belief, right? Just we truly believe that there is only one God, and so it's just a matter of what kind of path eventually you take culturally in that direction, or how you explain that, or where you come from, or how do you cope with that. Because even for co-religionaries, we all know we have, basically every person has a different idea, right? Whether you're Christian, Muslim, if you say, yeah, I am, but if you scratch just a little underneath the surface, you realize, of course, today nobody literally knows anything about religion, even among those who claim to have faith or to be religious, whatever, and also they fail miserably, of course, as a fallen kind, because they cannot understand the truth by definition, and even pretending so is actually an apostasy, right? It means that you are possessed by Satan, on a regular basis, and nothing else, and something you should be profoundly ashamed even to be still living for. Well, these people understood it, because if you go through things like what happened under, again, the walls of Vienna, you will just understand many things that today, I presume, we hardly, even in the case where the greatest slaughters actually occur, have the cultural tools and habituation and background to properly digest and understand. And that's the reason why people don't understand war, even today. And I would like to stress that, of course, that the Battle of Vienna of 1683 was the one that definitely thwarted the expansionist projects towards the west of the Ottoman Empire. That essentially, aside from the struggle that put up immediately afterwards to try to contain the losses resulting in political turmoil and instability, essentially began to decline irreversibly, or at least up to the first decades of the 18th century. It was possible for the Ottomans to westernize, but the ulama made all the reforms shipwrecking. And so this was a hell of a blow, to which also the Lipka Tatars contributed. To distinguish themselves from their relatives who fought for the Ottomans on that occasion, by the way, the Lipka Tatars put a bundle of straw on their headgear, so that since then it has become the tradition of the Lipkas visiting Vienna as tourists, or not, because in the past there were also other ways to do so, to wear a straw hat, right, to remember their ancestors who took part in the historic and decisive battle. Simple things, but that have a lot of meaning, as you understand. And I think it's beautiful, just as a folkloristic note. The Lipkas had, by that point, definitely linked their destiny to that of Poland. And as a consequence, they paid the price for the sins of the same confederacy. In fact, as you know, in 1772, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, weakened by years of internal political conflicts and having de facto become a Russian vassal, was attacked simultaneously by Austria, Prussia, and Russia, being literally cancelled from the political map, together with the nationalities that had constituted it, even. That Poland would reappear just at the end of World War I, the same with Lithuania. So, of course, all these countries, these identities, and including the Tatar ones, actually survived this phase, remaining dormant, but actually not even so much, as we will see now, for more than 100 years. You may say a short time, retrospectively, but not so much for what this meant, of course, in terms of political, institutional development, and just the fact that this became a lands of conquest, right, and were ruled as such. I mean, in some cases they were actually developed, right? Even the Tsarist regime objectively managed to make of Warsaw actually one of the industrial capitals of Europe, otherwise in a sea of agriculturalism. It's the same Russia really was. So there was naturally a potential there that was exploited, though, in ways that were harmful, of course, to the local populations. But since then, and exactly for this reason, the Lipkas participated in all the irredentist movements in Poland and Lithuania, rebellions and attempts to regain independence that set the peoples of the region on fire, right? The January uprising, the November uprising, and of course, before that, the Tatars participated in the Napoleonic Wars, and also with an excellent military appreciation. This is the time when Napoleon rekindles the hopes of Polish independence by proclaiming the Duchy of Warsaw. So sort of puppet state supporting the French against the Russians, the Prussians that also had been brought down. And on this occasion, Napoleon was greatly impressed by the war performance of the Polish Lancers that, of course, had kept serving the local rulers, previous generations. The Lanks had fallen out of use in Western European armies for centuries. But the Poles had kept the tradition alive, thanks also to the Lipkas, who were masters in its use. Naturally, as you know, during the 18th century, there were some of those aforementioned ethnic specialties that somehow came back together with cavalry, right, from the 17th century. As the pike disappeared on the battlefields, formations became thinner. Yes, musketeers had bayonets, but cavalry had a much greater freedom of employment and, in relative terms, power in that system. And indeed, spear fencing is very effective in this context, but also armor had practically disappeared, at least, among the majority of the troops, and especially the ones that these lighter troops were to chase, so namely the infantry, but also other light and medium cavalry. But such fencing is particularly difficult to learn too, right? And it requires notoriously a long training to master the secrets of such craft. So much so that Napoleon, that was always in search, as we've seen, talking about Napoleonic warfare in general, for, in fact, some antemnae, some skirmishers, explorers for his huge armies. It's been a bit the same concept of the comfort and support that the Tatars would give to the Polish heavies before, right? He wanted a regiment of Polish Lancers in his own imperial guard, right? So this was also a way of just politically behaving naturally, but the military skills were there, right? And the Poles and the Tatars contributed to that from a past of hundreds of years of equestrian culture of the finest order. Later, Napoleon established numerous regiments of Lancers, also in his French army, and of course in the other Napoleonic ones in Europe, but this would never reach the efficiency of the Polish Lancers. Poland and Lithuania would regain their independence, as we were saying before, only as a result of the reorganization of Europe at the end of the First World War. But as we know, there were precarious borders for many reasons, dictated by, naturally, the abstract and bizarre rules of diplomacy at some point, the enormous imbalances that had been produced by the Bolshevik Revolution, by, again, the reemergence after 123 years of a country like Poland, where that, somebody around had even forgotten it had existed as such. And this naturally gave rise to bitter conflicts, especially with Germany, because, as you know, there were several wars at the borders, and especially the issue over the attribution of Upper Silesia, right? This flared, especially during the Polish-Soviet War of 1921, that, again, we made a video on last year. And in these troubled times, where, of course, European culture was being shattered by, in fact, nationalism, socialism, it would essentially be acquainted with genocide quite soon as well. The Lipkas that could, simply take another direction, responded to the national appeal. And in 1919, in fact, they enthusiastically enlisted in the revived Polish army, forming the 13th Uhlans Regiment Wilno. And as we've seen, it was also the last contribution of the Lipkas to the Polish armed forces, because this was essentially the interwar period, and Poland was knocked out in 1939, and essentially even afterwards, until the collapse of the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact, it wouldn't, still today, that hasn't revived like a Tatar element in its armed forces. Indeed, there are many Tatar descendants in the Polish army, right, serving right now. There are many famous figures, like if you wonder, even international ones. Charles Bronson was a Lipka Tatar, banally. And so this tells you how somehow overlooked that this people really is. But this centuries-old history, by ending, represents the completion also of a path of national integration in the long and varied history of Europe. Right? And today, after troubled and restless centuries, Poland is finally a free state and a master of her own destiny, which is amazing if you think about it. And of course, not devoid of issues, because again, the today's Polish borders are not the ones they were at the time. The Germans, of course, complain of the fact that important parts of Eastern Germany were essentially assigned to Poland, but Poland can't legitimately complain that historical Poland was also given in part to her eastern neighbors. So of course these are matters that we can solve and we have been solving, telling the truth, successfully in a completely different context, also broader European integration that will hopefully keep on its path of military integration, so that Europe can simply resume what it's the irreversible trend, or is a colonial and protectionistic one in the rest of the world. And definitely the Tatar element is a protagonist of Polish history. And the many wars and battles and strifes, and sometimes frustrating ones, right, just like the ones we remembered before. And in fact, it's important perhaps to close with that example, because this allows me just to say another thing about the Polish cavalry charges. You see, after the German invasion of Poland, which began on September the 1st, 1939, was an Italian journalist, Indra Montanelli, who was a correspondent for the famous Italian newspaper, the Corriere della Sera. This was naturally times of the Axis, so fascist Italy was, comforting Germany, at least in a formal sense. So Italian correspondents had a specific political agenda to follow. And on this occasion, well, Montanelli was actually a good journalist, and he was following, literally together with them, the troops of the German General Heinz Guderian, not just a nobody, and he had been on the sides of the first battles between the Germans and the Poles. And Montanelli saw with his own eyes the presence of Polish corpses being informed, and we don't know by whom in that case, perhaps by Guderian himself, because they would interact, that the 18th Uhlans Pomorskish Regiment of the Polish army had launched, well, in fact, in this sense, the Germans told them, a suicidal charge against the Wehrmacht tanks with sabers and spears. So if you wonder where the myth that the Poles charged tanks, which is just a stupid thing to do, and so not a compliment of courage, right? This is actually Axis propaganda, right? That Montanelli would also, this sense, he could have had bit more of a journalistic scrabble to check, to describe, and in an article that eventually was taken up by the international press altogether, right, and then widely disseminated, especially by Nazi propaganda, to underline the technological gap that separated the two armies, but especially in order to accuse the Polish government of essentially irresponsibly sending to die its soldiers. And in reality, this was what we would call today a fake news. In fact, Guderian and his tanks did arrive at the site of the fighting shortly before Montanelli's arrival, and the commander of the 18th Polish Regiment, the Polish Colonel Kazimierz Mastalerz, spotting them, had ordered an immediate retreat. Right? You don't send cavalry against tanks, right? And there had been naturally a charge before, but against the 76th Infantry Regiment of the Wehrmacht, right? And Colonel Mastalerz, that was a intelligent commander, seeing the possibility of surprising his adversary, had ordered the charge, which had overwhelmed the Nazis, who actually were forced to ask for help from the tanks. And that's the actual story. Thus, of course, no Polish cavalry charge was ever carried out against German tanks, and actually almost all of the Polish cavalry charges against the Wehrmacht were successful, right? So, chapeau to the Polish cavalry. And as we've seen, to those units that were entirely composed by essentially the descendants of the Lipka Tatars, because they were ethnically selected as such. They bore still in 1939 the crescent and the star, and during the charge. And I think that this is also fantastic, right? World War II, so of course the important presence of cavalry charges, also successful ones. For example, the Italians against the Soviets, Izubshensky. There are these cases of still, of course, where cavalry, by the way, was just, consider this: the Wehrmacht actually invaded the Soviet Union on donkey back, right? That was the most common mean of transportation, even during times of mechanized warfare. The majority of the means were actually still on horseback, we can say, by 1941. So the concept here is that, first of all, cavalry, we could open a very interesting digression, because I was thinking actually to make a new series about properly horses in military history, but not in the usual way. At least there are some videos already dedicated to war horses in detail, etc. But in the sense like horse breeds and how were adopted by peoples that say, I don't know, Native Americans that have never seen horses before the Europeans showed up, and this kind of things. That is very interesting, and that tells you actually how close we are to the past, telling the truth, and how much animal intelligence, whether human or equine or whatever, is actually overlooked. And of course there are still cavalry charges carried. I think the Americans carried out one, like at least it was a team or something, on horseback in Afghanistan, right? So it's a quite interesting scenario, but especially in those tough terrains, right? Still, horses have something. The Chinese, for example, the borders with don't know whether the borders with India, but surely in the north towards the steppes, still use horses, and still we do. I mean, all our militaries have an important equestrian show off, traditionally simulated charges. I mean, it's pretty normal. Like in Europe we have plenty, but it's a much more global thing that you imagine. And I would like to conclude just remembering, in fact, how that bond between man and horse is also vital, perhaps, in the symbolically, allegorically, mythologically, and more, for the understanding of the entire military history and of how these Lipka Tatars are to be considered in their political allegiance and national fervor and military pride, a true European people. It's a case of Islamic faith, but being able to defend a Catholic Poland against the Muslim Ottomans. In what is the success of a political bond, right? Is the accomplishment of a civilization, the Western civilization. And look what happened to the other Tatars instead, right? That's an interesting comparison, in fact. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.